Hi, everyone, dear colleagues, dear listeners. I'm glad to welcome you to the seminar of the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies, New Ideas in Philosophy. Today, we are going to discuss the latest book of Professor Pereboom, Wrongdoing and the Moral Emotions, published at the Oxford University Press 2021. Dirk Pereboom is a Switzerland Sage Professor of Philosophy and Ethics, and also Senior Associate Dean for Arts and Humanities at Cornell University. We're happy that Professor Pereboom is here with us today. Nice to meet you. Now I pass the microphone to Professor Pereboom, please.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's great to see you. And thanks very much for having a look at my new Wrongdoing book, which is a bit different from the earlier two free will books that I wrote, in that it really focuses on morality and the moral emotions, as opposed to the metaphysics of free will, which was my focus in the past. So in this book, Wrongdoing and the Moral Emotions, it really has two aims. One is to, as in the past, kind of work out the implications for ethics and the moral emotions of a certain kind of skepticism about free will. But also in this book, I intended to have kind of an independent validity. So, you can be the judge of the extent to which this part of the project is successful, but I hope it to be kind of ecumenically attractive to people who disagree or don't believe in free will skepticism as well. But we'll see how persuasive that project is by your reactions. So the way I see free will skepticism, there's lots of different ways to define free will, as we see especially in the empirical psychological literature on this topic, where there are many different definitions of free will that are at play. And I don't know if you've seen this small book that I wrote recently on with Cambridge University Press. They have this series called the Cambridge Element series, and I have a small book in this series called Free Will, where I distinguish like a number of different senses of the term free will. But what's of interest to me in this project is free will as a kind of control, and in particular, free will that's the control required for a certain kind of moral responsibility. Not just any kind of moral responsibility, because I think that there are certain kinds of moral responsibility that are just obviously in place, regardless of what the truth of determinism or indeterminism is, for example. Hey, so this sense is the basic desert sense, which those of you who were in my Riga seminar may recall. But one thing I did in 2021 is that I kind of redid the definition some in order to deal with certain kinds of concerns or objections. Because in 2014, I defined free will in terms of the control required for basically deserved blame and praise. But there's some notions of blame that are so thin that it's just kind of obvious that blame in that sense is at least basically appropriate. And if it's basically appropriate, it's probably basically deserved. So for example, my old colleague, George Schur, you may be familiar with his book from about 15 years ago, In Praise of Blame. So he thinks of blame as a very kind of thin concept. It's just a belief-desire pair. The belief that an agent has done wrong and a desire that the agent not have acted as he did. Now, look, anybody, I think, can accept that notion of blame. It's so thin. That's part of what George Schur's aim was, to come up with a notion of blame that anyone could accept. But you can also, I think of it as basically appropriate, in just the way we can think of grief, say, as basically appropriate response to the loss of a loved one. So I've got to be a bit more explicit about what I'm worried about in my notion of basic desert. And what I'm worried about is the imposed harm or pain of blame and punishment, and correlatively the imposed pleasure or benefit of reward for doing the right thing. Okay, so That's my notion. And the formal definition is here: for an agent to be morally responsible for an action in the basic desert sense is for it to be attributable to her in such a way that if she was sensitive to its being morally wrong, she would deserve to be blamed or punished in a way that she would experience as painful or harmful. And the parallel goes for morally exemplary or more especially exceptionally good actions. And then the key thing, what makes it basic desert as opposed to non-basic desert, is that the deserted issue is basic in the sense that the agent, to be morally responsible, would deserve such blame or punishment, praise or reward, just by virtue of having performed the action with sensitivity to its moral status, and not, for example, by virtue of consequentialist or contractualist considerations. And so this contrasts with non-basic desert. And one of my predecessors here at Cornell, John Rawls, when he was here, wrote a paper and published it in the Philosophical Review on non-basic desert. And so he's got this, it's called Two Concepts of Rules. And so he imagines a society, maybe at least something like American society, in which people think about judges and lawyers in the legal system, think about justice, criminal justice, solely in terms of desert and retribution for wrongdoing. But still, at the same time, the justification for everybody thinking this way is utilitarian, okay, or consequentialist. So the reason that lawyers and judges thinking retributivistically and solely retributivistically in terms of basic desert is justified is because that turns out to be the best legal practice from the utilitarian point of view. Okay, so that's a kind of non-basic desert. And there are a couple people, Daniel Dennett, you remember, I know he's spoken to you, he was part of that Greenland tour. And also Manuel Vargas, more recently, they're advocates of non-basic desert. So Daniel Dennett, for example, in this book he wrote with Greg Caruso, I don't know if you're familiar with it, in which Greg, is a representative of the kind of position that I hold, and Dennett is a kind of compatibilist, but he says that he finds the idea of basically deserved punishment reprehensible. And if those of you who are in Riga remember him saying that and getting into a tiff with Patricia Churchland on this issue, on that boat in Greenland. But so he's very much an opponent of non-basic desert, at least when it comes to, basic desert when it comes to punishment, but he's in favor of non-basic desert, where the idea is our ordinary practice is appeals to the notion of desert, but that ordinary practice isn't basically justified, rather it's justified in terms of consequentialist or perhaps utilitarian considerations. Okay, so those of you who are familiar with my earlier stuff know that I think that basic desert is ruled out by skepticism about free will. And, I've got a bunch of arguments, or a kind of a detailed argument for skepticism about free will. And maybe for a lot of you, kind of the key notion, if you're compatibilist, the key argument is the manipulation argument. I know a number of you have reacted to the manipulation argument and disagree with me in my belief that the manipulation argument is sound. But be that as it may, I mean, that's what I think. And then I have some arguments against libertarian incompatibilism as well, but I won't rehearse those here. Okay, so I'll just take those as assumed for now. Although, as I said earlier on, I hope that the kind of ethical and emotional views that I defend in this Wrongdoing book would be attractive to people who are libertarians and compatibilists, as well as people who are free will skeptics. Okay, so what's the worry about basic desert and as it relates to the emotions? So you might think that moral anger is a problem for free will skeptics. And in my book, I talk about the Buddhist philosopher from the 9th century, Shantideva, who basically raises the issue that he said, how can we be angry at people given that people's behavior, whether or not it's bad, is caused by previously occurring factors. And so he says, well, there's a problem with anger. And, maybe that's not decisive. Maybe that just raising that concern isn't decisive. After all, half the people in the free will debate are compatibilists about anger and determinism. But he at least cites the basic issue. okay, way back, 1,200 years ago. And so, so you might think that, along with my new colleague, David Shoemaker, that there's absolutely no problem for anger, moral anger that results from determinism. But here's one way of seeing the problem. Gideon Rosen over at Princeton thinks the same problem arises for determinism and anger, namely that anger, or at least a lot of different types of moral anger have a component, a belief component, or at least are associated with a belief that that makes it inconsistent with determinism. And so Martha Nussbaum, for example, thinks that is just a stoic about the emotions, in the sense that she believes that emotions contain judgments. Some of the Stoics actually think that emotions just are judgments, and maybe that's not so plausible. I think the more plausible view is that emotions somehow involve judgments, maybe as a component, and then also have an affective component, which is distinct from the judgment. And a reason for thinking this is that you can have two people who make the same judgment about, let's say, a snake being dangerous, a snake in one's vicinity being dangerous, but they're having different affects. Okay, so it seems that the emotion all by itself doesn't dictate which emotion you have. It can depend on other factors as well. Okay, so I have an interest in the possibility of having emotions, but still rejecting the cognitive or judgmental part of it. After all, we free will skeptics still get angry, and we want to say, hey, we're not just being inconsistent there. We get a bit of a break. Okay? And so the Robert Roberts view, he's a professor down at Baylor University in Texas, allows for this. So he says that the cognitive component of an emotion is a concerned construal, which is a kind of response-relevant perceptual take that need not include a belief or judgment as a component. Emotions represent an agent as being a certain way that calls for a response, but the subject who has the emotion can avoid affirming that the agent is correctly represented that way. And he's got an example. He grew up as, I think, in the same kind of Christian tradition as I grew up in, where when I was a kid, we weren't allowed to do a whole lot of fun things on Sundays. And he grew up in a situation, I think, in which he wasn't allowed to go to the movies because this was considered sinful. So he says, you might go to the movies, and I suppose you've just rejected this part of your religious belief, and you go to the movies, but you still feel residually guilty as a result of having gone to the movies. Right? He says, you're not necessarily irrational if you feel that way, because you can still have the emotion, and the emotion can have this cognitive component. The cognitive component there is that going to the movies is wrong, but you can still reject it. So you can still have the emotion and reject it. So similarly, if you're a free will skeptic, you can still be kind of resentful at somebody for wronging you, but you can be genuinely resentful, but still reject the cognitive component of that resentment, which is, in this case, that the target of your resentment deserves pain or harm as a result of having done wrong. Okay, so in my view, it doesn't turn out to be the case that skepticism about moral responsibility, taken as a more general phenomenon, is true. Because after all, there are forward-looking notions of responsibility which don't involve the idea of basically deserved pain or harm, pleasure or benefit. And so the one that I developed already in the 2014 book, but more thoroughly in this new book, is that when you blame people, you aim at certain kinds of forward-looking goals, and the forward-looking goals include, protection from immoral behavior and reconciliation with those who have done wrong, and moral change. And the moral change or moral formation has a special role in, for example, the relationship between parents and children. So why do parents blame their children? You might think that some parents blame their children because they think they basically deserve the pain or harm of blame. But I think it's more likely that most parents who blame their children believe that they have a duty, or at least that it's a good thing to form the child's character in a moral way. And the point of blame is to form character, as opposed to giving the child what he or she deserves. Okay, so I think that that notion is already in place in ordinary practice, but I think that the notion of blame as basically deserved is also in place. So my proposal really involves subtracting a certain element of the ordinary practice of blame and praise, i.e. the basic desert part, and retaining the forward-looking part. So that's not it's a revision, but it's not as if it's a kind of replacement, because the ordinary notion of blame and praise already involves these forward-looking goals. Okay, so my colleague here, David Shoemaker, argues that anger is essential to blame. And this is an issue for me because, as I said, it may be that lots of kinds of anger and what Strawson calls the reactive attitudes in particular involve anger that has as a cognitive component a belief about basic desert. Now, Dave Shoemaker doesn't believe this, but we have to fight this out because I have to go to a seminar in a few weeks where we're going to have a debate about this. But be that as it may, he does think that in this 2017 paper, he argues that the blameworthy just is the anger worthy, right? So what it is to be blameworthy is to be worthy of anger. And there are a couple different construals of this. One is a response-dependent construal, and another is a response-independent construal. So Dan and Nelkin, for example, and David Brink are happy with the response-independent construal of blameworthiness. So it may be, on their view, that a really good sign of an action being blameworthy is it's being anger-worthy, but it's not as if the blameworthy just consists metaphysically in the anger-worthy. Okay, and so, but what Dave Shoemaker believes is the blameworthy in the realm of accountability. We can talk about that later. Just is whatever merits anger, the anger-worthy. That is, someone is blameworthy for X, if and only if, and in virtue of the fact that she merits anger for X. And his analogy here is the funny. Like if you make a joke, like why is a joke funny? Well, you may think it has certain kinds of properties that are just independent of anybody's reactions to the joke, but he has an argument, and this is coming out in a new book, that that's not the case. What makes something funny is just that it elicits certain kinds of responses, right? And he thinks that the same thing is true about being blameworthy. What makes something blameworthy, what makes a person blameworthy, is just that it elicits a certain kind of response. It's not some property independent of the response. Okay, so now, at least in the book, I don't choose between response independence and response dependence, but what I do argue is that the relevant response isn't anger. Because why? I mean, there are two reasons, I think. One is that there are cases of blameworthiness that are plausibly not cases of anger worthiness. And I have some examples in the book of wrongdoing. I mean, it's in those examples, the wrongdoing isn't seriously major, it's more minor, but there are cases in which it's just absolutely not clear that anger is the appropriate response. For example, in cases of, parents and teachers, I suppose, I mean, you're a teacher, and it's almost always the case that at least some kids in the class are surfing the internet instead of listening. It's a very common problem these days. And, it may be wrong in some sense, in some minor sense, to surf the internet instead of listening, given your commitments to the class and to your education. But, suppose somebody's kind of used to this sort of behavior and is not angry, but still it believes that it's worthy of protest and protests this behavior to the class, but doesn't exhibit anger. Is there something deficient about that kind of response? And I want to say, well, maybe not. And there are also cases of like parents and children. Like there are some children who don't respond well to blame that doesn't involve anger, but some kids are like really sensitive. Like my own kids are kind of that way. You only had to look at them a certain way and they felt really bad. I mean, anger was like way over the top as far as they were concerned when they were that age. So you might think that when kids like that do wrong, anger really isn't an appropriate response. It's something else. But still, I want to say that it's appropriate in cases of wrongdoing, all wrongdoing, to engage in the stance of moral protest. Okay, to morally protest the wrong, even if anger is not appropriate. So what I developed in this book in the second chapter is this idea of the stance of moral protest, and it's a psychological stance. So it's kind of a posture of mind, and it has certain kinds of functions. Now, let me say that part of the reason I kind of developed this notion of moral protest, which isn't original with me. Okay, so I think the first place it's really prominent in the literature is in Pamela Hieronymi's article on forgiveness in 2001. But so one thing that Pamela does in that article in 2001 is she thinks that the Strassonian reactive attitudes are essential to moral protest, and I want to separate the stance of moral protest from the reactive attitudes. And another source, maybe a negative source of my developing this notion of moral protest, comes from another colleague of mine, Sean Nichols, who back in 2000, when was it, 2007, he had a critical article about my stuff. So he himself is a free will skeptic, but he's concerned that like back then, when I cited certain kinds of emotions that are appropriate for a free will skeptic in the face of wrongdoing, I cited, disappointment and sadness. And he aptly remarked that sadness and disappointment aren't engaging. They don't engage the wrongdoer in the right sort of way. I mean, they're kind of passive emotions. And I think that that's right. So I need something more active, an emotion that's more active, but yet consistent with free will skepticism. And so what I develop here is this stance of moral protest. So it's a posture of mind that has certain functions, which are manifest as dispositions. So it's a stance of opposition to an agent for having performed a specific immoral action or a number of immoral actions, or for having a disposition to act immorally. And its function or moral practice is primarily to engage wrongdoers by communicating opposition to wrongdoing of a general type, together with moral reasons for the agent to refrain from it. So, so at this point, Michael McKenna has this book from 2012 on a conversational theory of responsibility. And it's a view that I can largely endorse, but he also thinks that the Strassonian reactive attitudes are essential to communication. And I want to deny this. So I want to say that what's common, it may be the case. I'm open to anger being appropriate in certain kinds of cases for practical reasons, but I think that what's common across all cases of blame, appropriate blame, is this stance of moral protest. Okay, here's an objection I think is interesting by that some people have raised. So you might think that unexpressed blame is possible, but the idea of unexpressed protest isn't even coherent. Okay? So sometimes we don't express blame, like when the cost is too high, you're going to blame somebody, but the person's going to make you pay if you blame that person. Or it may just be, you may think it's not worth it to blame, so you don't express blame. But is the idea of unexpressed protest, moral protest, coherent? And I think it is, because actually Eugene Cheslenko and Colleen McNamara have discussed this independently of me. So in 2015 and 2019. And so the idea is that, like the analogy here is an email message. You can have an unsent email message whose function is still to communicate, right? And so you can have an unexpressed stance of moral protest whose function is still to communicate. So the actual function of the thing may not be realized in every case. And this is, look, common from the literature on functions, right? Something can have a function which it doesn't actually express. Like, for example, you can have a heart that doesn't pump blood in the right sort of way, even though its function made to pump blood in the right sort of way. But the fact that it's a diseased heart and doesn't pump blood in the right sort of way doesn't mean it doesn't have that function. And so the same goes for the stance of moral protest and an unsent email, in my view. This account also applies to the self, a kind of self-blame. But here's something I want to highlight about this, that in that discussion on self-blame at the end of Chapter 2, there's a point that is kind of key, that and has become kind of more important in the discussion, namely this. It's something I alluded to when I discussed the notion of basic desert a little earlier on. So Randy Clark, in a recent paper that actually we discussed this summer, argues that blame can be basically appropriate and thus basically deserved, given that its target is knowingly done wrong. And I guess I'm going to agree with that now. And it's partly because of the way the term deserve or desert is used. I remember we're in Riga. I had this example. I remember in that square in front of the place where we met, there was a kind of a plaque in the pavement saying that the city of Riga actually deserves to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Well, okay, what does that really mean? It just means that it's kind of appropriate, or maybe even in a basic sense appropriate, that Riga is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So I think that blame can be basically appropriate on a very thin conception of blame like George Scher's, where it need only involve a belief that the agent has done wrong and a desire that she not have done so. Okay, but the key thing is, and I'll stress this, that and I think this is going to be the core issue between free will skeptics and anti-free will skeptics, is whether the imposed pain or harm of blame and punishment can be basically appropriate. So that's my line in the sand. Okay? And I think that if determinism is true, or a certain kind of indeterminism is true, that's what's not appropriate. But look, the stance of moral protest is appropriate, and when the reasons there are for taking on that stance are the right sorts of forward-looking reasons, like moral formation and protection. Okay, and there's a kind of forgiveness that I set out in the 5th chapter that parallels this, and we can discuss that in the session. But now I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Okay, colleagues, we can go right into the discussion part of our seminar, and I will pass the microphone to Artem Besedin, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Dirk, for this wonderful, very, very interesting book. And when I read the book, I appreciated the improvements that you made in your theory of basic desert. I think that they are really important, and they really make this make your view more clear, and gives you your view some more power to answer some objections. So I see that your new definition of basic desert is not vulnerable to many objections that were suggested against it. And I also didn't know about your adoption of this Gunnar Bjornsson's example with infection that replaces your original spontaneously originated machine, spontaneously created machine that played a role of neuroscientists in your answer to some objections. I think that Gunnar's option is in some respect better. And I think that this work in general is a kind of humanist work. I find this book very humanist in various senses. First of all, it is humanist because its aim is to give a hope to humanity, and it intends to give some aim to our for our activities and existence in general. But also this book seems to me a kind of Renaissance work. I mean, like Italian humanist work, in the sense that there is a lot of history of philosophy there. So you cite Stoics and Hegel, Descartes, Spinoza, almost everybody. And there are extensive quotations from the scripture, and they play a very important role in your own argumentation. And the style of this book is very this is a book that is a good literature. The style of this book is a very good example of a philosophical style. That's what is my general impression of this work. But also, I want to address you some questions about this work. So, in your talk, you mentioned that you suggest a kind of replacement and not a overall revision of our psychology, of our practices. And you mentioned that the notions that you describe are already in practice, in our practice. But then, isn't this book fundamentally a descriptive work? So, do you pretend to, for example, to explain what blame actually is? What we should take it to be, in the sense that we must purify this notion, not modify it. And if this is true, then the question is, isn't this book work in a Strassonian vein? Because it looks like a general Strassonian approach to describe our human nature, as he calls this. So this is my general question. And another feature of your book that reminds me Strawson is your focus on forgiveness. Forgiveness is an important topic in Freedom and Resentment. This is not often mentioned, but Strawson says something about forgiveness in that paper, this is a part of this general question of your view about Strassonian attitude in your Strassonian methodology in your own case. And my last question will be, after all, do you think that the basic desert theorists, basic desert philosophy is harmful? That you started in the beginning of your book. You write that resentment is related to the emotion of anger, and it is harmful. It is vicious for not only in the moral sense. It can be harmful for knowledge. It is intellectually harmful. And then, do you suggest to stop philosophizing on a basic desert because it is a kind of harmful philosophy? Thank you. These are my questions.
Well, wonderful. So thank you much for the very kind words about the book as a whole. So first of all, I mean, how Strassonian am I? And the thing is that in a way, I am more Strassonian than I might have appeared in the 2001 or 2014 books, because I take into account human nature and how it really works. Although I want to differ from Strawson in the following sense, and this also addresses your question about whether it's my view is really a descriptive view in the way that Strawson's might turn out to be, or one that argues for a certain kind of revision. And so one way of taking Strawson is that Strawson, describes our ordinary practice. Look, we've got these reactive attitudes. In the case of wrongdoing, it's guilt, resentment, indignation. Those are the key ones. And then the question is, do those attitudes have free reign in our practices? Not the case, because we have cases in which people are resentful or indignant, but yet are the actions turns out to be justified or excused, or the individual may be exempt. Okay, so those are the cases in which our ordinary attitudes are illegitimate. So you have a descriptive account, but then it has normative input, right? It's not just purely descriptive account, the Strassonian one, because our ordinary practice has excuses, justifications, and exemptions that push back against the having of and the expression of reactive attitudes on certain occasions. Okay, so mine is, I agree with all that stuff in Strawson, but I want to push it a bit further, because I want to say that to the extent that our attitudes do involve this basic desert presupposition, that's a strike against them. Okay, so I'm more revisionist than Strawson is. And there is a kind of something you see in a lot of British philosophy in the 17th and 18th centuries, a certain kind, this idea that human emotions aren't really malleable. We can't really change how we are. And that's something I address in the first chapter to a certain extent. And it turns out that, I have this, case of this Gene Briggs, this Canadian anthropologist who went up to live with this group of Inuit in the Arctic. And it turns out that this group, they train their kids never to be angry. Now, I'm not saying this is the right way to do things, but it kind of works, okay? And then the thesis of the book is that they have to do this because if there's a division in this community, then everybody dies because of the environment they live in. It's so fragile. Okay, so this seems to show that human emotions are malleable to a certain extent. And I want to say, to the extent that skepticism about basic desert is true, we have a reason to change the way to change our emotional profile. And I want to say in the end, we should favor moral protest over anger. Although, in this third chapter, which I haven't talked about yet, I do argue that anger has its roles, so I went over to, West Point, our military academy here, and I gave a talk about 10 years ago and the officers in the Army he says he trains them not to be retributive in their emotions to the other side, but to adopt what he calls this measured aggressive stance, which is not a blaming stance, but it's an aggressive stance that facilitates the kind of aggressive action that the soldiers have to take in war. And so that you might think of that as a kind of anger. Anyway, it's an aggressive, very strong emotion. But I think that doesn't involve basic desert. And so it's in principle on the table. But also in the chapter on forgiveness, I argue that there are going to be kinds of cases in which people are angry in a way that involves the basic desert belief, but it's perfectly legitimate. I mean, even though the belief is false, still the practical value of being angry in certain circumstances outweighs the kind of epistemic problem of having a false belief. Okay, so in the end, I want to make more of in response to the very end of your the very last question you asked, I want to make my peace with anger a bit more than I did in the previous books, because I want to say that, look, there are kinds of anger like the measured aggressive stance, which are in the clear as far as free will skepticism goes. But also, there are all sorts of practical situations in which I think anger is going to be legitimate. It's certainly legitimate to have, but even legitimate to express. Right? But still, free will skepticism is a kind of strike against anger that has these basic desert presuppositions.
Well, thank you. Artem Yashin next.
Professor Pereboom, thank you for this opportunity. I really enjoyed the book, and even though I'm not a free will skeptic, in many respects, I'm very sympathetic with your stance of moral protest, the forward-looking spirit, and how constructively yet carefully you intended to work with emotions. Even though I'd like to know what specialists in emotional cognition would say about psychological plausibility of your account. I'm not an expert, so I don't know. Now I have a question regarding your discussion of deterrence measures directed towards nonviolent crimes, such as tax fraud or shoplifting. As you pointed out, and as we discussed in one of our previous seminars, I believe, the version of quarantine model set by Professor Caruso does not offer practical means to deal with nonviolent crimes. If I got it correctly, well, this passage was really complicated. So, well, I hope I got it correctly. You propose some additional practical policies based more or less on consequentialist grounds in order to make quarantine model more realistic. So it actually works. Does Professor Caruso disagree with you? And if he does, why is that? You describe the differences between your position and Dennett's position, but how does Caruso respond to your points? Does he reject any kind of manipulative use of agents, or does he defend the simplicity of his quarantine model? And I also have a rather naive question about some possible concerns for preventative detention. In chapter 4, you mentioned that drastic preventative measures like neural testing are unlikely to be used in the nearest future, and I agree with that. And then you discuss demonstrable intentions and so on. But let us consider a case of very powerful artificial intelligence. So like a neural network of artificial intelligence of modern type, but much more complex. Now, it can predict the occurrence of violent crimes with relatively high certainty. So it's not 100%, but the certainty is very high. So it can recognize patterns, but it cannot offer any explanations or any reasons of why the criminal behavior is about to begin. Just like modern neural networks, they cannot explain anything, they just recognize the pattern. Maybe it would be the pattern of biography or genetic information or both. We don't know, there is just an answer. In your opinion, would this conclusion made by the AI about a potential criminal be a sufficient basis for detention or not? So anyway, I will certainly recommend this book to my friends, and I believe it can be especially helpful when moral anger is some sort of milieu one effectively is pickled in. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for those questions. So first, let me address the issue about Greg Caruso. So yeah, so he and I have very similar views. In fact, later today, another Cambridge element called Moral Responsibility Reconsidered, written by Greg and me, will appear for free on the Cambridge website. And so if you're Facebook friends of mine, you'll find it there as well. Or if you're Facebook friends with Greg, you'll find it there as well. That should happen sometime today, coincidentally. Okay, so we agree on a lot of stuff. But as you know, we don't agree on how extensive the applicability of the quarantine model is. And so what I want to say is, you know, for one thing, I agree with Greg that there are a lot of kind of nonviolent crimes, like maybe drug use, that I think that should be decriminalized. So the United States is turning that way. It used to be that, say, marijuana use was criminalized. It's no longer criminalized in any sense in a lot of places, like here in New York State. So number one, but then there are other nonviolent crimes that are real problems. And you know, lots of I mentioned my daughter is now in the financial industry in New York City, and a lot of my students, especially there's a very tight connection here between Cornell and the financial industry. So a lot of my students and a lot of our alumni are there. And you think about how it works. You know, the government sets certain rules to regulate the trade of financial instruments, but then these companies are very competitive, and so people are motivated for reasons of profit to kind of push up against those rules, right? And every once in a while the line is crossed, and you know, and I guess I don't think that there's anything, when I think about, you know, all of my students and whatnot who are in the financial industry who do cross these lines, do I think that it'd be good if they were like quarantined, for example? And I think, no, I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me if it's hugely costly. And I also don't think, you know, maybe they're not ideal people from the moral point of view, but I don't think there's anything deeply wrong with them either. I mean, they're in the system here. It's our, you know, capitalist system, and it, you know, and there's competition, and so they're going to be strongly motivated to bump up against the rules, maybe even cross the line from time to time. So what's the best way to deal with this? I think the best way to deal with this is by having, you know, penalties like fines, for example, in egregious cases, maybe, as we do in the United States, maybe short prison sentences, maybe not too long. Hey, so I think that that's justified on grounds of, on consequentialist grounds, and maybe even on grounds of, as Victor Tadros argues, on grounds of the duties that we have. But Greg disagrees. You know, I raised this as a protest to his, as an objection in a session on his recent book, Rejecting Retributivism, and he pushed back against me. So we do disagree on this, right? And so he thinks that, you know, maybe rehabilitative measures are in order here. And I think the answer is not, because I don't think that there's anything to rehabilitate really, or anything major. All we want is, you know, kind of a pushback, disincentive to engage in this sort of behavior. That's good enough. Right. So yeah, that's a disagreement that's unresolved, and we don't discuss this in the book because, you know, I don't think that we're about to come to agreement on this issue. But I do disagree with what he has to say on this. Okay, so yeah, so there's a very hard question, and it's a question not only for I think free will skeptics like myself, but for everybody, like what to do about preventative detention. You know, and I've got that famous case from California in the 70s. And where where the boyfriend was in psychiatric care, and then he was declared like fit, and he was released, and then he killed the girlfriend, and he had expressed intentions to kill the girlfriend earlier on. And so then what's the standard? If somebody's dangerous, and as you put it, the AI machines can determine that somebody's dangerous, but you don't have an explanation for the danger, like, is preventative detention okay? And I mean, this is like a kind of a very hard issue. And, I have two citizenships. One is the citizenship of Canada, and the other is the citizenship of the United States. And in Canada and the United States, these issues are treated differently. As I mentioned in the book, in Ontario, they're much more yeah. So at least in Ontario, the province of Ontario, they're more likely to allow preventative detention than they are in most places in the United States, because of that sort of difference. Now, but you need some sort of bright line, because you don't want judicial bad behavior. You don't want the legal system detaining a lot of people who haven't committed crimes for say bad reasons. And so what gets proposed, and what Corrado down at UNC has proposed, is this bright line of demonstrable intention, that somebody has an intention to do wrong, and this can be shown. And I like that bright line. Now, the question is that, suppose you've got artificial intelligence, and it can predict when people are dangerous, but is your thought that it might not be able to predict whether that intention exists, but yet that people are dangerous? Yeah, so that's very hard. Maybe it has to do with how serious the crime is. So if you can demonstrate by means of artificial intelligence that it's 99% sure that somebody's going to kill somebody in a week, but you still can't demonstrate, you can't show that there's an intention to kill, then what do? I mean, it's like, if it's only for a week, then it seems that you should do it, right? Because you've got a duty to protect the innocent. But I do think it's a very difficult question to which there's no clear answer, but at least for now, and given the technology that's currently in place, I kind of like the demonstrable intention bright line, right? That has to be shown.
Thank you very much. Tarasenko, please.
Hello, dear colleagues. Hello, Professor Pereboom. Thank you for your excellent book and the equally interesting presentation of your ideas here. I'm very glad to take part in this discussion. Thank you for opportunity. I have no extended comments on your book, but I have a question, and it's about your understanding of deliberation. If I got it right, you think that in some sense, deliberation does change the world, but we should understand its impact, if we can call it impact, in an epistemic but not ontological way. I may be heavily influenced by compatibilist intuitions, but it seems to me that such an understanding should be suffice for a moral responsibility in the basic desert sense. This is especially noticeable, I think, in the case of your answer to the two-door problem produced by Van Inwagen. Yes, your deliberation was predetermined, but your whole mental life, character, and so on are consist with this its result. You are the kind of person who makes such a decision. You would like such a decision to be made, and you would like to act in accordance with such a decision. Why then can't we blame or praise you simply on the basis of such an act? It seems that in many cases of deliberation, we also assess the moral side of our action and make a decision in accordance with this assessment. You in these cases expecting that you may be blamed for it, maybe, or praised, but you still prefer to act in this way. At the same time, we don't think of ourselves either during deliberation or after the fact as being manipulated, and we do not believe that determinism could serve as a moral justification for our action. So basically, I want to know why your understanding of deliberation is not enough to accept compatibilism, you think. And if this consistent between our action and whole our personality is still not enough to be moral responsible in the basic desert sense, then I think I really don't get something. I want to understand what is the intrinsic value of basic desert if we anyway have consequentialist or contractualist or any other reasons to blame or prize someone, why we should reject in a virtue of lack of basic desert, why basic desert is imported by itself. That's my questions. Thank you.
Okay, super. Yeah, so those are kind of important questions, and they're being discussed currently just in the last year or so, being discussed in great detail in the debate here. So let me try to address it. So yeah, I guess fundamentally, I guess my argument against any sort of compatibilism is that manipulation argument. So on my view of deliberation, somebody deliberating in the best possible way can be, and still, suppose somebody deliberates in favor of performing a crime, and the deliberation is rational and is in accord with the account that I provide. Does that person basically deserve, the harm or pain of punishment? And then I want to argue that the answer is no, because there's no in principle difference between determinism and manipulation. And so that's the argument. But then you raise the following issue. So what does it basically deserve blame? How would that supplement an account of a forward-looking account of blame? So what's the kind of real difference between my view and the view of someone who does hold that there's basically deserved blame, where that amounts to basically deserved imposition of the harm or pain of blame? And look, I mean, the thing is, it's interesting. This is a kind of a range of views that has emerged about what basically deserved blame would allow. Okay, what kind of reasons for punishment and blame that basic desert would provide. Okay, so on the most extreme side, there's Michael Moore. Maybe you're familiar with his book, Placing Blame. Okay, so he's a legal theorist, was at Penn, various sorts of places. He has a view that, for one thing, basic desert, desert in the area of criminal punishment comes with a kind of proportionality specification. So the idea of desert is that it's, for one thing, basic. So it's not based on utilitarian or consequential considerations, and deserved punishment is proportional to the crime. Okay, so Michael Moore, I mean, the way David Brink puts it in a recent article is that he knows Michael Moore really well. He thinks that basically desert is both necessary and sufficient for just punishment, and sufficient. Now, you can't quite think it's sufficient, because if somebody said they're going to blow up the world, if we punish the criminal, then you wouldn't do it. But anyway, it's pretty close to sufficient. Okay, so that's way out there in the extreme. So, but I think that, I do think that a lot of people in this country anyway believe that the Michael Moore view, that, it's a view that Brink calls pure retributivism. So it's a view that, like, the only consideration that's relevant to punishment is retributive or basic desert, and that the basic desert reasons are sufficient and are almost sufficient and necessary for punishment. Okay, so but most of the people who believe in basic desert don't hold that. So Michael McKenna, for example, he's got a view he calls wimpy or weak retributivism. Scanlon thinks that he believes in basic desert, but doesn't think that basic desert ever justifies criminal punishment. The most it can justify is on its own is withdrawal of goodwill. So Dana Nelkin has both she and David Brink are retributivists, but Nelkin thinks that desert reasons never all by themselves provide reason for punishment. You always need something else. So Sean Nichols, my colleague, even though he's a free will skeptic, thinks that it's sometimes retribution's okay, but he thinks that, again, it provides a very, very weak reason. Okay? So a lot of people out here think that even if we do basically deserve the harm and pain of punishment, it's a very, very weak reason, not a strong reason. But there are people like Michael Moore and maybe Stephen Morse at Penn who think that the reasons are really strong. So there's that sort of difference. But when it comes to someone like Dana Nelkin, even though she and I are opponents, and she's very much a compatibilist, I'm not. When it comes to kind of the practical implications of basic desert for punishment, I mean, there's almost no daylight between our views. It's very, very similar. So what she thinks is that what she thinks is that basic desert makes a difference only in cases where you've got to choose between two people. So if you have two people and you got to punish one of them, or else everything, you know, goes to hell, then you punish the people, then you punish the person who basically deserves it more. But all by itself, basic desert provides no reason for punishment, certainly not a sufficient reason. So yeah, so I guess that you know, practically speaking, my real opponents are people like Michael Moore and Stephen Morse, who have this really strong view, which I think Immanuel Kant seems to have held as well, but maybe not consistently, that the desert reasons are necessary and pretty close to sufficient for punishment, and it's for punishment that's proportional to the crime.
Okay, so thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you very much. Eugene?
Yeah, hello, Dirk. Thank you for a great book. It was very interesting to, you know, to go through it and to see the details of moral theory that can be derived from your views on free will. When I was reading, I usually wanted to raise some objections, but unfortunately, the next page contained some arguments against my objections and blocked my ideas. It was very, very disappointing, but very enjoyable, and it was very, very nice time of reading you. And I'm now working on some critique of moral responsibility skepticism, which starts not from metaphysics or epistemology, but from moral philosophy, like Gideon Rosen works. And it seems to me that in this book, your approach seems in some aspects similar to what Rosen does, but it has huge details, and therefore it is hard to criticize it. There are many places in the book worth careful discussion, but I want to raise one clarification question, just to make sure that I understand some significant aspects of your reasoning correctly. So the question is about relationship between the moral anger and retributive thought. You said that when a mature human subject target another with an expression of resentment, her moral anger will typically be associated with the cognitive content that he basically deserved to be blamed or perhaps punished in a way that he would experience as painful or harmful. And it is clearly that there are cases in which person experience moral anger, and it is appropriate moral anger, and does not think that the object of the anger deserves to suffer for what he has done. And your reply, as understood it, if I understood it correctly, is this case would be a case of contradictory belief. So if this person is a moral skeptic, he can reject the content, the cognitive content of his thought, or he maybe not be a skeptic and does not reject the content, and in this part he will be a person who has a contradictory set of beliefs. I would like to know if you allow a possibility that some person feels resentment and does not believe that the object of the resentment deserves to suffer for what he has done, and yet does not have a contradictory set of beliefs. There seems to be a kind of moral anger or kind of desert where I does not wish that the object of resentment to suffer. This is not, and this is not the case where I am a free will skeptic. For example, it can be some kind of abstract anger that arises in response to injustice, systemic injustice. There is no, in this case, there is no immoral conduct of some agent B who acts wrong, and so I blame him for that. It is just things that go wrong, and that disappoint me, and I feel moral anger. And it is not, it can be not a case of moral protection or reconciliation or protection. So I can think that everything is wrong and nothing can be changed, and still feel that feelings, feel that emotion, moral anger. So my question is, can there be, in your view, some types of moral anger that does not in themselves content retributive thought, and this kind of moral anger will not be used as an instrument of reconciliation, protest, and so on? So that's what I want to know.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yes. So as you noted in the quote you read of mine from the 2021 book on resentment, that even I say it's typically the case in resentment that it contains this this cognitive content, right? This basic desert cognitive content. All right. So I got to be careful there, and I think that you're correctly kind of sensitive to this issue, because it's hard from the philosophical point of view to make a convincing pronouncement about what the cognitive content of any bit of anger is. Now, one thing you might say is that, look, we can divide anger up into all these different categories. And among the different kinds of anger, there's indignation, there's resentment, and you can just define indignation and resentment in terms of a basic desert type cognitive content. So that's one thing you could do, but that's, not very satisfying. I mean, your question is, look, are there types of anger that don't have basic desert as cognitive content? And so I guess I'm allowing that the answer is yes. In the chapter on self-blame, and in this second chapter, the one I gave the presentation on, at a certain point I give the example of the civil rights leader in the U.S., Martin Luther King, who Martha Nussbaum discusses, and a lot of people discuss, his particular stance here in the context of these issues. He himself counseled people fighting for civil rights not to express their views in an angry way, and that's because I think anger often results in what we call the backfire effect these days. That if you express your views angrily, they tend to be counterproductive when it comes to the forward-looking goals. But that's not the issue I address here. It's just like, what about his anger? Was it retributive? And look, I mean, what I say here is, and this is on page 48 in the book. I say, although he was angry, it's not evident that his anger was typically retributive, by contrast with being defensive and protective of a community and a people. Right? And so there, I kind of think of his anger, now who knows exactly, because he's not around for us to ask him about this, but his anger as kind of in the league of what I call the measured aggressive stance. So here's this big injustice, right, against Black people in the United States, and you got to fight it. And you're mad about this, and it's possible to be retributively angry at people who are racist, but it's also just to have this like aggressive stance against like the structures of racism in the United States. It's maybe, I mean, you alluded to the claim that you could be angry about the way the world is, as opposed to being angry with with individual people and how they behave. And I think that's just clearly a possibility. So yeah, I think and I think that I underexplore this possibility in this book. Okay, and I think that you're kind of noting this at least implicitly, and I think that this is an area where it's worthwhile to do more research. I mean, what types of anger are there? Real types of anger that don't involve beliefs about basic desert? And there's certain people, like you mentioned, Gideon Rose and Martha Nussbaum is another. I mean, they both think that anger has this kind of payback component, right? You're trying to pay people back for what they've done, but at least I say in this book that that's not always the case for anger, and King is an example, and the measured aggressive stance is an example. But I think it's definitely valuable to explore in more detail than I do in this book, like types of anger that evidently don't involve beliefs about basic desert. Okay? So yeah, so I think that's a good research project.
Am I right that the King's case is a case of moral protest?
Yes, that's what I think. It's moral protest, but it also involves a certain kind of, I think, measured aggressive stance, because it's not only a case of, like in cases I described of the, the teacher and the parent and the kid and the school administrator like myself and the badly behaving professors, right? There's no serious threat. Whereas in the case of King, right, and the civil rights movement, I mean, there was just so much anti-Black violence in the United States at that time, and certainly before that time, that like moral protest all by itself, the stance of moral protest might have been insufficient, right? You also need something like the measured aggressive stance, because here you're fighting for people against injustice, where that injustice actually includes very serious violence, right? So maybe you need something more than the stance of moral protest, and something like the measured aggressive stance is appropriate. So that's why I suggest here that his anger is a kind of defensive anger, that's protective of a community and a people, namely Black people in the United States.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, Artyom Yunusov, please.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Pereboom, both for your book and your presentation. At the beginning of your today's talk, as well as in the beginning of the book, you expressed a hope for a sort of ecumenical effect of both. And I think you may be glad to find that in myself, as well as it seems in Artyom Yashin, this hope is to an extent realized, because I'm not a free will skeptic, I'm rather a compatibilist. But I am very sympathetic towards a lot of what you say in your book. So, by instance, I have strongly anti-retributivist intuitions. I do not see how pain and suffering of another human being can be a non-instrumental good. I can see how it can be an instrumental good, but not a non-instrumental one. So in this sense, I'm not so sure about basic desert. I'm not sufficiently clear, I think, on the notion, despite you spending so many years trying to get it as clear as possible. So I think to get a basic sense of my position, it is vaguely Scanlonian. But I'm especially sympathetic towards the practical consequences of what you offer, of what you and what Caruso offer, such as the recommendation of sort of moral reform that we should undertake, or we might undertake to make things go better. But what interests me about it is how do you yourself regard the sort of status of this suggestion of yours? I mean, do you see it as something that is morally required, or something that is rather supererogatory? So, because me, myself, I think that, yes, they seem to be better in a very important sense than those that are actually in practice today. But my concern is, wouldn't it be too much to ask, basically, of all the people to adopt the stances you offer to adopt? Say, moral anger is practically rational, even though it is not epistemically rational, and given the fact that our nature, well, it may be more than our nature can bear to reject such attitudes. And given that the costs of such a moral reform may be very very high and burdensome overall for our society. It may be very hard. It may take a lot of just a lot of psychological resources for us to perform such an overwhelming reform. So how would you yourself characterize your offer? Is it something that we should morally do, or is it something rather that is morally advisable, but it would be wrong to demand from someone to do that?
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I've recently engaged with this question with somebody else who's offered a seminar for you, John Fisher, because Fisher says, look, it's if you look at the arguments for example, the manipulation argument, I mean, there are rational people that accept it and rational people that reject it. So you can't really demand that. You can't really demand that people accept it and become free will skeptics. And I think I agree with that. So as far as the philosophical stance goes, I think it'd be inappropriate to demand that people take it on. After all, how do we think of philosophy? We don't think philosophy is coercive. I mean, the reason that these questions are philosophical questions and not questions in science or a mathematical type science is that we can't reach convergence on them, right? I mean, we can't. I mean, the reason they are philosophical questions is that they, well, I'm exaggerating a bit now, but one characteristic of philosophical questions, generally philosophical questions, is that we don't have a method for reaching convergence and agreement. So we don't have rational agreement. We can't reach rational agreement on these questions. So as a result, I think it's inappropriate to try to force people to, have philosophical beliefs when they themselves are reasonable in their disagreement with those beliefs. So yeah, I think that's okay. So so another possibility is just to discount opposing points of view. I think that's also unreasonable because I think that if you're on the other side, I think that I mean, the thing is that there's my stance as a philosopher, and as a philosopher engaged in practice, I'm a free will skeptic. But if I step back, I say, okay, there's some serious probability that I'm mistaken about this and that the compatibilists or the libertarians are right. So I've got to take that into account in any practical recommendation that I make for the application of these results. So, but I mean, it's interesting that, perhaps we can reach a certain level of convergence, as you yourself are suggesting, on the practical implications of these theoretical claims. So, so I do think that, so that's something that's occurred maybe partly as a result of in discussion of these critical discussions of retributivism in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, is that people have become much more cautious about what the extent to which negative basic desert, aka retributivism, has legitimate practical implications. Now you're suggesting this stance yourself because you say, look, if you think about retributivism, it's hard to believe that harm can be a non-instrumental good. As I noted in my response to an earlier question, if you think a lot of the retributors like Scanlon, for example, or Daniel Elkin, or Sean Nichols, or Michael McKenna, I mean, they, even though they are compatibilists and believe in basic desert, all of them think that just upon reflection, the reasons given by negative basic desert for practical implication are very weak. Okay. So that's a kind of convergence. I mean, the thing is that, like I said earlier, when it comes to me and my, compatibilist friend, Dan and Elkin, I don't think there's any difference between the practical implications that I take my view to have and the practical implications that she takes her view to have. Hey, they're very similar. Okay, so, but when it comes to, I mean, you raise a very important practical issue about people changing their mindset about this. And at the beginning of the book, I do talk about, Jean Briggs and the Aboriginal people in Northern Canada who train their kids never to be angry. The book is called Never in Anger. And so it's a possibility. And then I cite some studies by some recent studies on human emotional malleability. It turns out to be more malleable than you might think. But at the same time, even if you agree that it's malleable, you make a good point, namely that the malleability comes at a cost, okay? Or actually changing people's attitudes comes at a cost. And it may be that, if people are embedded in a certain culture and they're, reached a certain age, that it's just so difficult to change their general emotional dispositions. So, but that's a practical concern. So I allow, in general, that that practical concerns can weigh up against any practical implications that my kind of theoretical stance may be presumed to have. Okay, so look, I mean, in my view, a lot of people who have resentment and indignation have emotions with a cognitive content that turns out to be false. Now, suppose they recognize it to be false, or at least they're open to recognizing that it's false. Should they then change their emotions? Well, this comes with a practical cost, especially if the emotions are a result of dispositions that have been in place over a long period of time. So the practical reasons, right? The practical reasons against changing the emotions might be sufficient to recommend that they not be changed. Right? That's a possibility in my view. My view allows for that. Right? Now, at this point, there are empirical questions that I haven't determined the answer to that are relevant, like how hard is it for people to change their attitudes? In the first chapter, I've got some examples. Like, if you take people's, like a couple hundred years ago, if you look at the way Europeans, for example, reacted to people who are mentally ill, I mean, it was very different, I think, from the way people generally react to people who are mentally ill today. So it does seem as if, that sort of disposition is malleable, and it's worthwhile to try to change it, right? So, and the same goes for, people of, different racial groups or ethnic groups. It might be natural for people to be disposed to have negative attitudes towards people of these groups, but still, this can be changed, and it's malleable, and it's worthwhile to change. And so in the case of basic desert, I suppose you have to ask, like, what's the benefit? What's the cost? What's the practical benefit? What's the practical cost of changing or not changing the emotion? And look, again, if the alternative is, say, the Dan and Elkin view or the Scanlon view, then you want to say, hey, there's hardly any difference. Right? There's hardly any difference between what my view would recommend practically and what their views would recommend practically. And so in those kinds of cases, I think the practical benefit is minimal. So maybe it'd be better not to try to affect a very costly and difficult change.
Thank you very much. Anton Kuznetsov, please.
Yes, thank you, Derek, for your book. Glad to see you again. It's a great opportunity to have you. And as Artyom, I'm very sympathetic to your views, even though I'm not a free will skepticism, but my views are kind of very close to free will skepticism. And it is ironic that to overcome moral anger, it is a great need of enormous amount of will. So, before this book, I've never thought of you as existentialist. And I just opened your last books and found out that even in your last books, there are many existentialist ideas, and in your last books also. And my question is about practical worries again. As Artyom said, I see that there are some problems with your kind of existential ideas, given some economical and political differences, and for example, some experiments where people overcome anger. These experiments, they are from Western world, where people have some time, some resources, and so on. And it seems that it looks like that it is impossible to overcome practically moral anger. And you already answered some worries about it. And I have just personal question for you. How do you evaluate your personal success? I mean, about overcoming moral anger. Do you still feel some moral anger or not?
Ah, great. And the answer is yes, I do. I don't know. So here's a kind of personal thing. I think, maybe it has to do with like family roles. I grew up in like a big family with 6 kids, all more or less the same age. And I think that I was assigned the role of being kind of a peacemaker and not being angry myself. And so I find that that's a role I have here at Cornell as well as an administrator. So I do think it's costly. I mean, the thing is that I do think that when let's say at the professional level, at least in our context, and it's very different, I think, in the United States from in different professions, and also it's different over time. But if in academia you show, let's say, anger in a policy debate or whatever, this is a serious strike against you. It's pretty negative. So it's something that I just don't do. I mean, if I'm unhappy with and feel some anger towards somebody for holding a certain stance, I think I have by this time developed a pretty strong disposition not to express that emotion in overtly. But I think that maybe that goes back to when I was a little kid growing up in the particular family context that I did. So yeah, I think that, I don't know, it does seem possible. I mean, from the Gene Briggs study, it does seem possible to train people not actually to feel anger, but I don't really want to weigh in on this. But so I guess for me personally, the key dividing line is between having anger, feeling angry on the one hand, and then expressing it on the other. And yet, right. So I think that personally, I certainly feel the anger, but then I think that maybe expressing it in the typical context, especially given my roles in society and my family, is not the optimal thing to do. Okay, so I think that for me, that's the dividing line. So it isn't that I don't think I'm exceptionally in control of actually having the feeling, but I think that for better or for worse, I have the disposition not to kind of manifest that feeling in these familial and professional situations. Now, whether that's the way everybody should behave is a further question. So you might think, for example, so Nancy, my wife, I asked her about this. I said, look, I gave her the example of Martin Luther King and Gandhi. I said, but both of them did not express anger in their protests, and they were especially effective. And, they're effective people. So, but then she said, but look, Martin Luther King, like, he's not angry, but would his protest have succeeded if he didn't have the people like, Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan in the background, people who were angry and expressed their anger. So one way to think of this is a kind of general moral ecology that, or moral emotional ecology, that in order for society to work, you need people like King and Gandhi on the one hand, but you also need people who are overtly angry on the other. And so maybe for, let's say, a protest movement to work and to achieve justice, you can't have everybody being like King or Gandhi. You need some people like King or Gandhi, but you also need people who are angry and express that anger. So that's a possibility, that you need that kind of mix, or that that variation in dispositions. So I'm certainly open to that. That's kind of an idea I'm playing with. I don't know what you think about that, but that's not inconsistent with my view, because after all, I think that being angry and expressing it can have practical benefits, and there can be practical reasons for it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's good for some people not only to be angry, but to be happy about expressing it, because that fits in that fits into a certain kind of moral emotional psychology that's overall effective. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Oh, I should think of it after our seminar, because we don't have much time.
Okay. Good.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I will take the word myself. Thank you very much, Dirk, for such wonderful book and wonderful presentation. I'm really in love with your peace-loving and philanthropic view. But my question will be a bit provocative, I guess. I think it will not surprise you. It will be about the stance of moral protest and the role of moral emotions in it. Although you mentioned the moral emotions in the title of your book and really talk about them a lot, I think it could be argued that you neglect its fundamental significance in moral responsibility question. Well, the question about the appropriateness of moral responsibility in many theories, as far as I know, is just the question about the appropriateness of these moral emotions. But you claim such moral emotions as resentment, indignation, and other sort of agential anger are not essentially involved in the stance of moral protest that you defend. And you admit that this kind of emotions can be valuable, but only as far as they have some instrumental significance, as far as they can serve the aim of moral formation, reconciliation of in a relationship, protection from wrongdoing, etc. I think that it can be argued that such kind of response and such kind of stance of moral protest, since it does not essentially include distinctive moral emotions, are just not moral response and moral stance. This stance seems much more like an objective attitude in the Strossonian sense. I think it can be plausibly claimed that the expression and actions of a person can be identical in moral responsible and in non-moral responsible context. Well, consider the situation when a stranger steps on the feet in the bus and when my cat bites my feet. It seems that in both of these situations, I can appropriately exhibit just the same behavior for the same instrumental purposes. The same movement, same face grimace, same yelling of the same words, etc. And with the same aims to stop the offender, to protect myself, to reconcile the relationship that has been impaired, etc. But it seems obvious that moral responsibility would be appropriate only in one of these two cases, in the case of the bus, but not with my cat. But if the stance and the actions are the same and are appropriate to its aims in both of these cases, then what matters in the appropriateness of moral responsibility and what makes the moral difference between these two cases are not this stance, these acts and aims, but something else. And it seems plausible to claim that it is moral emotions what matter. It can be appropriate for me to feel resentment in the bus to the stranger, but not with my cat. But if moral emotions are what matter in the appropriateness of moral responsibility, then any stance that doesn't essentially involve these emotions is not a moral stance. And that seems to be a ground to claim that what you describe seems more like an objective attitude. If that is correct, I think it can also explain some kind of strange features of your reasoning, for example, when you're talking about responsibility of children and mentally ill persons who commonly don't count as moral agents, or the case with Lieutenant Kilner that seems to be very alike with the case of Grizzly Bear. You draw the distinction that Grizzly doesn't understand moral reasons while mentally ill child could understand it, but still it seems that these facts makes no difference to thoughts, feelings, action and stance of the lieutenant himself. So he will do and feel the same if the children were treated by Grizzly. And all such kind of strange features could be resolved under the presupposition that the stance you describe is an objective stance. But I think, obviously, you will disagree with such an interpretation. So my questions are, what is the role of moral emotions in the appropriateness of moral responsibility if they are not the core of this appropriateness? And what distinguishes the stance of moral protest from the objective attitude?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So if you go back to my 2001 book, so there's a challenge that's not quite as sharply put as yours is that I responded to, namely that it was a general question about the objective attitude, right? So is the only alternative to the Strassonian picture one that involves the objective attitude? And they're argued that the answer is no, because I said that there are moral emotions that are non-reactive, or at least moral emotions that don't involve a basic desert presupposition. And there I cited emotions like sadness and disappointment. Okay, then as I pointed out earlier, people like Sean Nichols argued that sadness and disappointment aren't sufficiently engaged. They're kind of passive emotions, so you need something a bit more engaged. And so then I said, okay, what about the stance of moral protest? Now, as you rightly point out, you can imagine a non-emotional stance of moral protest. So I guess what I was thinking, and this is why your question is going to occasion some changes in kind of future versions of this view. What I was thinking, and I'm thinking now that this isn't quite justified, is that the stance of moral protest itself is an emotional stance. But you're pointing out now that it's possible to have a stance of moral protest that isn't emotional, that's maybe purely affect-free, right? So here we want to make a distinction between kind of the affect-free or emotion-free stance of moral protest and an emotional stance of protest. Now, what makes the difference? And that's worth thinking about. Like I said, I was thinking that moral protest itself is a kind of, a kind of stance, a kind of emotional stance. But I think you're correctly noting that I haven't defended that, and so I haven't shown that that's the case. Now, so one possible answer to your question is that there's a version of the stance of moral protest that's intrinsically or all by itself emotional. I haven't defended that, as I just acknowledged. But let me turn to like one of the characters in my argument against Dave Shoemaker, say the mother who blames the child not in order to, but doesn't feel indignation or resentment and has no payback emotion, but still aims at moral education, the moral education of your child, because it's her duty. Now, you may think that the emotion involved there is a certain kind of moral care, like she cares for her kids. I mean, you can imagine this, right? You care about your kid a lot, and you care a lot about the kid's future and about the kid's moral development, and this is why you protest. So in a case like that, the moral stance of moral protest is animated, I think, by the emotion of moral care. And I think that that's not going to be a case of the objective attitude, because the care in that case, I think, at least my sense, is not something, let's say, an emotionless machine could do. So yeah, so that's one possibility. And there's care. Again, there is, I refereed a paper recently for Ethics, according to which, disappointment is a kind of a key moral emotion and is involved in a lot of blame and is engaging. And that's another possibility. So it could be that in certain kinds of cases, for example, in failures in a relationship, you blame the other person with a stance of moral protest, but the relevant emotion there is a kind of disappointment, right? A kind of disappointment. It's another possibility. So yeah, I think that my book doesn't contain an answer to your question, but these are the ways I tried to develop it, by saying that there are moral emotions that don't involve a basic desert presupposition, and in that sense aren't reactive, that can yet distinguish between what I'm recommending and the objective attitude.
Well, yeah, okay, thank you very much. Vadim Vasiliev, please.
Thank you, Dirk. It was a pleasure to read this book. I have two questions. The first question would certainly not be novel for you, but anyway, it's about your version of manipulative argument. Your argument, as we all know, is constructed in such a way that at its final phase, we realize that we are not responsible for the actions we have believed before that we were responsible. But why not to run through this argument in the opposite direction? We can start with our common feeling of responsibility, that is from the fourth case in your argument, and then show gradually that we are responsible even in the first case. If such a move is possible, then it is not clear how this argument can prove anything. So my question is, first question, how to block the reverse way of running through this argument. The second question is about your definition, fundamental definition of basic desert in this book. You claim, and I quote, the desert at issue is basic in the sense that the agent, to be morally responsible, would deserve such blame or, I make a stress here, or blame or punishment, prize or reward, or again, just by virtue of having performed the action with sensitivity to its moral status, end of quote. My question is about or in this phrase. Why do you talk about blame or punishment, for example, and not about blame and punishment? This point seems to me important because it seems to be possible, and actually you partly responded already to this question, of course. But anyway, it seems to be possible that blame, for example, is deserved basically, but punishment is not. Now look in a concrete case. Now look at such cases. What to do in them? Would such a case be a case of basic desert situation? Is it here basic desert or not? That's my second question. Thank you again.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yes. Now, let me answer the second question first. I think that's a good point, and it's I mean, in just thinking about it a bit, it kind of makes me, I think if I had to write it up again, I'd write it up differently in response to your question. I think that, because I agree with you that it's reasonable. Here's a reasonable position where you think that blame of the sort that I'm describing here is basically deserved, but punishment of the sort I'm describing is not basically deserved. And the definition should allow for that. So I think you're just right about that. And if I think about my colleague Dave Shoemaker's view, now, you know, Dave Shoemaker's whole 2015 book, More Responsibility from the Margins, he never talks about desert, but he does believe that there's a certain kind of basic appropriateness of blaming emotions, but he doesn't think that there is any basic appropriateness of subsequent measures such as punishment. So there's that sort of view. So is that and you know, my own colleague, my recently acquired colleague believes it, right? That so I mean, if he were to frame his view in terms of basic desert, he would affirm basically deserved blame, but not basically deserved punishment. So it's, thank you very much, because so I should allow for that. That's correct. So on kind of the going backward in the on the manipulation art, that's in fact a possibility. I remember, and so like, what is my response to that? So I remember when I kind of first thought of this, or first set out this 4-case argument back when I was at University of Vermont. This is like 1987 or something. And George Scher was my colleague then. And I remember he said that. He said, I can just run the, he just came out with this book called Desert, where he argued for desert and basic desert. And he said that. He's like, I run the argument backward. Maybe a more recent instantiation of this is on the part of like Michael McKenna. Michael McKenna and I had a debate about this in the maybe about 12 years ago or so. So here's what I would say, that going through these cases is a kind of process. I think you're exactly right, that just purely formally, you can say, look, I'm starting with case one. Case one, we have the non-responsibility intuition. There are no, suppose we agree that there are no responsibility relevant differences between any two adjacent cases. And then you draw the conclusion that the agent in case 4, the ordinary case, is not morally responsible. But yeah, you can start with the 4th case. And so in the 4th case, what? So if you're a compatibilist, you say, oh, it's my intuition that he is responsible. And then we've already agreed that there are no responsibility relevant differences between adjacent cases. And then it would seem as if your conclusion about case one should be that the agent in case one is also responsible, again, in the basic desert sense. And the way McKenna does it, he said, well, maybe we shouldn't agree at the outset that the agent in case four is morally responsible. You could just say, well, it's, you know, it's a question, it's unclear. But then that conclusion carries over to case one, right? So if we agree in case one that it's unclear whether Plum is responsible in the basic desert sense, and there are no responsibility relevant differences between the cases, then the conclusion to be drawn is that it's unclear whether in case one Plum is morally responsible. So I'll tell you, so my response was this, that going through the cases is a kind of process. And it's going to be kind of bad, I suppose, and also that there's nothing kind of rationally coercive about the argument. So in case one, what I'm doing is I'm kind of fishing for a kind of intuition. So if in case one, I get someone to agree that the agent is not responsible, and I can get that conclusion from a lot of people, then at least going through the cases from beginning with case one and ending in case four, I can get that provisional conclusion, the one I want, i.e. that the agent in case four is not morally responsible. But still there's a kind of process involved, and the process I think is relevant to answering to your question. So if you begin with case four and the initial intuition is that it's unclear that the agent is responsible, then as you encounter these cases, that initial intuition can face some blowback, right? Some resistance. And so what I'm betting on is that there's going to be a significant chunk of the population that even if they begin, as you counsel with case four, by the time they get to case one, they're going to, as a reflective equilibrium position, have the view that there's no way that the agent in case can be unclear whether the agent in case one is morally responsible. Okay, but you could argue, look, I mean, there are going to be a lot of people that think that the agent in case four initially believe that the agent in case four is responsible, and at worst that it's unclear that it's responsible, for whom going backward through the cases, that intuition is preserved all the way to case one. And, and this is the point about the non-coerciveness of the argument. I don't have a response to that person. I can't say that someone who has that reaction to that way of considering the argument is unreasonable. Okay? So I'm just on a fishing expedition. If I can get the person to go with me in the end, no matter which way we go through the argument, from case one to case four or case four to case one, then that's good for me. But I cannot claim, I think, and this is also pertinent to your question, I don't think that I can show that that's the only rational way to consider this argument. As far as I can see, the stance that Michael McKenna has and that you maybe have is also rational. I mean, if those are your intuitions about the cases, whether you go through the argument from case one to case four to case one, then, I can't start yelling and screaming at you that you're irrational. I have no argument of that sort. Okay, so that's the structure of the argument as I see it. And my hope, again, is that if you begin with case four and go backward through case one, that by the time you get to case one, you'll be agreeing with me as opposed to someone like Michael McKenna or the compatibilist.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dirk. You have already answered not to all our questions, but to all our questions that were asked today. Thank you very much. And as a tradition of our seminar, the main lecturer has the last word. So, Dirk, if you'd like to summarize somehow or make some expression, please.
Yes, okay. So one kind of upshot of this discussion is highlighting some issues that I should address in the future. And one issue that I should clearly address in the future involves the moral psychology of anger. That I think this initial assumption with which I began way back in the 90s, that indignation and resentment clearly involve a basic desert presupposition, which is ruled out by free will skepticism. I don't think that I have the arguments to maintain that. So maybe, you know, there are kind of technical ways of defining resentment, indignation, so they have that upshot. But I mean, that's in a way not to the point. The question is really, are there types of anger, moral anger, that don't involve a basic desert presupposition? I've already acknowledged this in the case of the measured aggressive stance, but you know, there are other possibilities there as well, as some of you have pointed out. Okay, so that's a kind of a key issue. And then there's the issue about, you know, practical application. I mean, the thing is that I don't think that, you know, it's kind of a general issue about philosophy and life, right? So philosophical questions, as I pointed out, are questions that on which we can't expect to reach rational agreement. Okay? So suppose our philosophical stance has certain practical recommendations. Right? How should we regard those practical recommendations? Should we, you know, advocate for them, for their being, you know, enacted in society, or should we have a more conciliatory stance? And I think I want to go for the more conciliatory stance. So I think we want to find common ground between people who hold our own philosophical stance and people who disagree, but as far as we can see, rationally disagree. And, you know, and there the practical recommendations may be somewhat different. And there I think we should try to achieve compromise. Look, in some cases, like the case of Dan and Elkin, as I pointed out, there don't seem to be any practical differences. So that's kind of a lucky coincidence, but we can't expect that to be the case for all practical philosophical disagreements. Okay, well, thank you very much. This has been very productive. All of your questions were wonderful, and I'll be thinking about them as I develop this position further.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for this wonderful seminar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. See you again soon.
See you soon.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.